Along the slow and steady flow of the Nile River, life in ancient Egypt followed a predictable rhythm. Each year unfolded in much the same way. The river rose, the land was watered, and the fields were prepared. There was no urgency. People understood that time moved slowly, and they moved with it. Daily life was shaped by routine. People woke at familiar hours, prepared simple meals, and returned to the same tasks. Farming was central to existence. Seeds were planted carefully, waited upon patiently, and harvested without haste. The cycle repeated endlessly. There was comfort in repetition. Nothing needed to change quickly. The Nile would return, as it always had. Administration existed quietly. Records were kept, measurements were taken, and supplies were counted. These tasks were repetitive, and intentionally so. Writing was slow, deliberate, and careful. Scribes worked patiently, documenting ordinary matters, nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. The structure of life remained stable. Days passed gently, weeks followed weeks, and seasons changed gradually. People adapted to the rhythm. They did not rush it. There was no reason to hurry. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, calmly, steadily, and without interruption. Time moved forward quietly. You do not need to pay attention. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story has just begun. As time continued to move slowly along the Nile, life in ancient Egypt remained deeply connected to routine. Nothing happened quickly. Nothing needed to happen quickly. People understood the rhythm of waiting. They waited for the river. They waited for the soil. And they waited for the seasons to change. Daily activities followed familiar patterns. Morning began quietly, with simple preparations and unhurried movement. Work filled the day, slowly, methodically, and without urgency. Farming required patience. Fields were prepared carefully, seeds were planted evenly, and time was allowed to pass. Growth could not be rushed. Waiting was necessary. The land responded only in its own time. People accepted this. They did not resist it. They adapted to it. The cycle repeated itself, year after year, season after season. There was no need for variation. Consistency provided stability. The Nile returned predictably. Flooding occurred gently and receded slowly. This rhythm shaped everything. Life adjusted itself around these changes. Administration continued quietly. Measurements were taken regularly. Records were written carefully, and supplies were counted repeatedly. These tasks were repetitive, but repetition created order. Order reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was unwelcome. Scribes worked patiently. Writing was slow, deliberate, and exact. Mistakes were avoided by moving carefully. There was no reason to hurry. Documents described ordinary matters, grain amounts, labor assignments, and simple observations. Nothing dramatic appeared in these records. Meetings were held occasionally. They were calm, measured, and unremarkable. Discussions repeated familiar ideas. Decisions were postponed when necessary. Postponement was normal. It allowed time to consider. Time was always available. Ancient Egypt valued stability. Change occurred gradually, almost unnoticed. Daily life remained modest. People focused on basic needs, food preparation, simple labor, and rest. Entertainment was minimal. Silence was common. Time continued to pass evenly. Days followed days. Weeks passed quietly, and seasons shifted slowly. Nothing demanded attention, Nothing required focus. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, calmly, patiently, and without interruption. You do not need to stay alert. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues slowly. As time continued to pass without urgency, life in ancient Egypt remained steady and predictable. Nothing happened suddenly. Nothing needed to happen suddenly. People were accustomed to waiting for the river to rise, waiting for the water to settle, and waiting for the land to respond. Daily routines rarely changed. Each morning began in the same way, with slow movement and familiar preparation. Work was approached patiently. Tasks were completed carefully, without pressure and without haste. Farming required attention to timing. Seeds were placed in the soil, and time was allowed to do its work. There was no way to speed the process. Growth followed its own pace. People accepted this naturally. They understood that rushing brought no benefit. The cycle repeated year after year. Flooding came, water spread, and then slowly withdrew. Fields were left to rest, and then prepared again. This repetition was expected. It created reliability. Reliability brought calm. Administrative life continued quietly. Records were maintained consistently. Measurements were repeated, and counts were verified carefully. These tasks were intentionally repetitive. Repetition reduced error, and error was undesirable. Scribes worked for long periods. Writing required patience. Each mark was placed carefully. Each line followed the last. There was no need to hurry. Documents recorded ordinary details, harvest totals, work assignments, and inventory lists. Nothing about these records was exciting. Meetings occurred occasionally. They were calm, methodical, and predictable. Discussions revisited familiar points. Decisions were often delayed. Delay allowed stability. Stability was valued. Ancient Egypt avoided disruption. Life continued at an even pace. People focused on essential needs, food preparation, basic labor, and rest. Entertainment was limited. Quiet moments were common. Time moved forward gently. Days blended together. Weeks passed quietly, and seasons changed gradually. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required effort. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, patiently, steadily, and without interruption. You do not need to stay alert. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues calmly. As time continued its slow movement, life in ancient Egypt remained deeply rooted in repetition. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing needed to be rushed. People understood that time followed its own rhythm, and they learned to move with it. Daily life followed familiar paths. Morning activities began quietly, with slow preparation and unhurried motion. Work continued steadily throughout the day. Tasks were completed one by one, without pressure and without urgency. The land required patience. Fields were observed carefully. Water levels were noted, and time was allowed to pass. Nothing could be forced. Growth depended on waiting. Waiting was expected and accepted. The cycle of the Nile shaped everything. Water arrived, spread slowly, and then withdrew in its own time. This process repeated itself endlessly. Year after year, season after season, people trusted this pattern. They did not question it. There was comfort in predictability. Administrative routines continued quietly. Measurements were taken regularly. Records were updated carefully, and supplies were counted repeatedly. These actions were familiar. They followed the same structure, the same order, and the same pace. Scribes worked patiently. Writing required focus and steady hands. Each symbol was placed carefully. Each line followed the previous one. There was no need to hurry. Documents described ordinary matters, crop totals, work assignments, and simple inventories. Nothing dramatic appeared in these records. Meetings were held when necessary. They were calm, orderly, and unremarkable. Discussions repeated known ideas. Decisions were delayed if needed. Delay allowed reflection. Reflection preserved stability. Ancient Egypt valued balance. Change occurred slowly, almost unnoticed. Daily life remained modest. People focused on basic needs, food preparation, manual labor, and rest. Entertainment was minimal. Silence was common. Time continued to pass evenly. Days blended together, weeks passed quietly, and seasons shifted gradually. Nothing demanded attention, nothing required effort. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, calmly, patiently, and without interruption. You do not need to pay attention. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues slowly. As the slow passage of time continued, ancient Egypt remained guided by habit and repetition. Nothing changed quickly. Nothing was expected to change quickly. People adjusted their lives to the rhythm they knew. They woke at familiar hours, moved without hurry, and returned to the same tasks. Work followed a steady pattern. Each task was completed calmly, without pressure, and without urgency. Farming continued to shape daily life. The land was observed carefully. Water levels were noted, and decisions were made patiently. Seeds were planted, and then left to grow on their own. There was nothing else to do but wait. Waiting was part of life, and waiting was accepted. The Nile continued its predictable cycle. Water arrived gradually, covered the fields, and slowly retreated. This movement was expected. It required no reaction, only patience. Administration remained quiet and consistent. Records were reviewed regularly, numbers were checked, and lists were updated. These actions were repeated often. Repetition created order. Order reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was avoided. Scribes worked steadily. Writing required time, attention, and care. Each symbol was placed deliberately. Mistakes were avoided by moving slowly. Documents described ordinary matters, food supplies, labor assignments, and simple counts. Nothing dramatic appeared. Meetings occurred occasionally. They were calm, methodical, and predictable. Discussions repeated familiar ideas. Decisions were delayed when necessary. Delay was acceptable. It allowed time to pass. Time was always available. Ancient Egypt valued stability. Change happened gradually, almost unnoticed. Daily life remained modest. People focused on essential needs, preparing food, performing simple labor, and resting. Entertainment was minimal. Quiet moments were common. Time continued to move evenly. Days followed days. Weeks passed quietly, and seasons changed slowly. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required effort. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, patiently, steadily, and without interruption. You do not need to stay alert. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues calmly. As time continued to move forward quietly, Life in ancient Egypt remained steady and unchanged. Nothing required urgency. Nothing demanded speed. People continued to live within familiar routines. Each morning began slowly, with calm preparation and unhurried movement. Work followed established patterns. Tasks were repeated daily, in the same order, at the same pace. There was comfort in this repetition. Nothing unexpected occurred. The rhythm of the land guided all activity. Water levels were observed patiently. Soil conditions were noted, and time was allowed to pass. Nothing could be forced. Nature moved on its own schedule. People accepted this without resistance. Waiting was normal and expected. The Nile continued its slow cycle. Water arrived gently, spread across the land, and withdrew gradually. This pattern repeated endlessly, year after year, season after season. Administrative life continued quietly. Records were maintained carefully, lists were reviewed, and counts were verified. These actions were routine. They followed the same structure and the same pace. Scribes worked patiently. Writing required steady focus and deliberate movement. Each symbol was placed carefully. Each line followed the last. There was no reason to hurry. Documents recorded ordinary details, grain storage, labor distribution, and basic inventories. Nothing dramatic appeared. Meetings occurred occasionally. They were calm, orderly, and unremarkable. Discussions repeated familiar points. Decisions were delayed when necessary. Delay was accepted. It allowed stability. Ancient Egypt valued balance. Change occurred slowly, almost unnoticed. Daily life remained modest. People focused on essential needs, preparing food, performing basic labor, and resting. Entertainment was minimal. Silence was common. Time continued to pass evenly. Days blended together. Weeks passed quietly, and seasons shifted gradually. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required effort. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, calmly, patiently, and without interruption. You do not need to stay alert. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues slowly. As time continued to pass slowly along the Nile River, life in ancient Egypt remained calm, steady, and deeply repetitive. Nothing moved quickly, and nothing was expected to move quickly. People understood that time did not belong to them. It belonged to the land, to the river, and to the seasons. Each day began in nearly the same way. Morning arrived quietly, without urgency, without change. People rose from rest, prepared simple food, and returned to familiar tasks. Movement was slow and deliberate. There was no need to rush. Work filled the day gently, one task following another, without pressure and without interruption. Farming continued to shape daily existence. The land was observed carefully, water levels were watched patiently, and decisions were made without haste. Seeds were planted and then left alone. Nothing could be forced. Growth required waiting, and waiting required patience. Patience was learned early and practiced often. The Nile continued its endless cycle. Water rose slowly, spread across the land, and then withdrew again. This movement was expected and accepted. It happened the same way, year after year, season after season. People trusted this rhythm. They did not question it. They did not resist it. There was comfort in knowing what would come next. Daily life adjusted itself around this certainty. Administration existed quietly in the background. Records were kept carefully, measurements were taken repeatedly, and supplies were counted again and again. These tasks were repetitive, but repetition created order. Order reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was unwelcome. Scribes worked patiently for long hours. Writing was slow, careful, and exact. Each symbol was placed deliberately. Each line followed the one before it. Mistakes were avoided by moving slowly and paying attention. Documents described ordinary matters, grain storage, labor assignments, tool inventories, and routine observations. Nothing dramatic appeared in these records. Meetings occurred occasionally, and when they did, they were calm, orderly, and unremarkable. Discussions repeated familiar ideas and known concerns. Decisions were delayed when possible, and delayed again if necessary. Delay was acceptable because time was always available. Ancient Egypt valued balance. Balance required patience, and patience required repetition. Change happened slowly, almost without notice. Daily life remained modest. People focused on essential needs, preparing food, performing simple labor, and resting when the day ended. Entertainment was minimal. Quiet moments were common, and silence was familiar. Time continued to pass evenly. Days blended together, weeks passed quietly, and seasons shifted gradually. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required effort. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, patiently, steadily, and without interruption. There was no urgency, no climax, and no sudden change. Everything moved forward at the same calm pace. You do not need to stay alert. You do not need to focus. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues slowly. As time continued to move forward without urgency, life in ancient Egypt remained steady, familiar, and unchanging. There was no sense of hurry, and no expectation of speed. People understood that time moved on its own, and they followed it quietly. Each day resembled the one before it. Morning arrived softly, without announcement, without disruption. People rose slowly, prepared simple meals, and returned to the same routines. Movement was careful, measured, and calm. There was no reason to rush. Work continued throughout the day, one task leading gently into the next, without pressure and without interruption. The land required patience. Fields were observed closely, water levels were noted, and decisions were made slowly. Nothing could be forced. Nothing could be rushed. Growth happened only when time allowed it. Waiting was not an obstacle. It was a necessity. The Nile continued its endless and predictable cycle. Water rose gradually, spread across the land, and then receded once again. This movement was familiar, expected, and trusted. It repeated itself endlessly, year after year, season after season. People built their lives around this certainty. There was comfort in knowing what would come next. Daily existence adjusted itself naturally. Administrative work continued quietly. Records were written carefully, measurements were repeated, and supplies were counted patiently. These actions were performed again and again. Repetition was intentional. Repetition created order, and order reduced uncertainty. Scribes spent long hours at their work. Writing required attention, steady hands, and deliberate motion. Each symbol was placed with care. Each line followed the previous one. There was no benefit in moving quickly. Documents recorded ordinary matters, grain storage levels, work assignments, simple inventories, and routine observations. Nothing dramatic appeared in these texts. Meetings occurred from time to time, and when they did, they were calm, orderly, and unremarkable. Discussions returned to familiar topics and repeated known concerns. Decisions were postponed when possible, and postponed again when necessary. Delay was accepted because time was abundant. Ancient Egypt valued balance. Balance required patience, and patience required repetition. Change occurred slowly, almost without notice. Daily life remained modest. People focused on essential needs, preparing food, performing simple labor, and resting at the end of the day. Entertainment was minimal, quiet moments were common, and silence was familiar. Time continued to pass evenly. Days blended together, weeks passed quietly, and seasons shifted gradually. Nothing demanded attention, nothing required effort. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, patiently, steadily, and without interruption. There was no urgency, no climax, and no sudden change. Everything moved forward at the same calm pace. You do not need to stay alert. You do not need to focus. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues slowly. As time continued its quiet and uninterrupted passage, life in ancient Egypt remained firmly rooted in routine. Nothing changed suddenly, and nothing needed to change suddenly. People accepted that time moved slowly, and they shaped their lives around that truth. Each day felt familiar, almost identical to the one before it. Morning arrived gently, without sound, without urgency. People rose from rest, prepared simple food, and returned to tasks they already knew. Movement was slow, careful, and unhurried. There was no reason to move faster. Work continued calmly throughout the day, one small task following another, without pressure and without expectation. The land continued to guide all activity. Fields were watched patiently, water levels were observed, and decisions were delayed until the right moment. Nothing could be forced. Nothing could be rushed. Growth followed its own pace. Waiting was not a problem. It was part of life. The Nile continued its familiar cycle. Water rose gradually, spread quietly across the land, and slowly withdrew again. This pattern repeated endlessly, year after year, season after season. People trusted this movement. They relied on it and built their lives around it. There was comfort in knowing what would happen next. Daily existence adjusted naturally. Administrative life continued quietly in the background. Records were written slowly. Measurements were repeated carefully, and supplies were counted again and again. These actions were repetitive, but repetition created stability. Stability reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was avoided whenever possible. Scribes worked patiently for long periods. Writing required focus, steady hands, and deliberate motion. Each symbol was placed carefully. Each line followed the last. There was no advantage in moving quickly. Documents described ordinary matters, harvest totals, labor assignments, simple inventories, and routine observations. Nothing dramatic appeared in these records. Meetings occurred occasionally, and when they did, they were calm, measured, and unremarkable. Discussions returned to familiar ideas and repeated known concerns. Decisions were delayed when possible, and delayed again if necessary. Delay was acceptable, because time was abundant. Ancient Egypt valued balance. Balance required patience, and patience required repetition. Change occurred gradually, almost without being noticed. Daily life remained modest. People focused on essential needs, preparing food, performing basic labor, and resting when the day ended. Entertainment was limited. Quiet moments were common, and silence was familiar. Time continued to pass evenly. Days blended together, weeks passed quietly, and seasons shifted slowly. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required effort. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, patiently, steadily, and without interruption. There was no urgency, no climax, and no sudden change. Everything moved forward, at the same calm pace. You do not need to stay alert. You do not need to focus. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues slowly. As time continued its slow and endless movement, ancient Egypt remained steady in its final rhythm. There was no sudden ending, no clear moment of change, and no sense of conclusion. Life continued quietly, as it always had. Each day followed the familiar pattern. Morning arrived without announcement, work proceeded without urgency, and rest came naturally. Nothing new was expected, and nothing new was required. People continued their routines, without question, and without anticipation. The land remained the same. The Nile continued its patient cycle. Water rose slowly, spread gently across the fields, and withdrew once more. This movement required no reaction, only acceptance. People trusted the river, as they always had. They did not hurry it, and they did not resist it. Time belonged to the land, not to the people. Administrative systems continued to function. Records were still kept, lists were still reviewed, and measurements were still taken. Most of these actions had become automatic. They no longer required thought, only repetition. Scribes continued their work, placing symbols carefully, line after line, page after page. Writing remained slow, deliberate, and exact. Documents described ordinary matters, food storage, labor organization, and routine inventories. Nothing dramatic appeared. Nothing unexpected occurred. Meetings continued to happen, though they mattered less with time. Discussions were calm, often repetitive, and rarely decisive. Decisions were postponed or left unresolved. This felt natural. Ancient Egypt did not change quickly. It faded slowly, through small adjustments and gradual shifts. There was no single moment, no clear ending, only time continuing forward. Daily life remained modest. People focused on simple needs, preparing food, performing familiar labor, and resting when the day ended. Entertainment remained limited, quiet moments remained common, and silence remained familiar. Time continued to pass evenly. Days blended into one another, weeks followed weeks, and seasons changed as they always had. Nothing demanded attention, nothing required effort. Ancient Egypt continued to exist, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, patiently, steadily, and without interruption. Eventually, the systems weakened, not suddenly, but slowly. Processes became less precise, records became less important, and routines softened. But life continued. People adapted, as they always had. There was no panic, No urgency and no resistance, only acceptance. History moved forward, without ceremony, without announcement. The story did not end. It simply rested. You do not need to remember details. You do not need to stay alert. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. Time continues to pass, slowly, quietly, and without interruption. The story rests here, at the same calm pace,